do it? Yeah, this is perfect. Good evening, everybody. My name is Alyssa Pacey, and I'm the archivist here at the library. On behalf of the Cambridge Public Library, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. This is our first program that we've done together with Partnership of Historic Bostons, and we've had an enormous response from the community. So we're absolutely thrilled that you could join us this evening. I'd like to thank History Cambridge for putting us in touch with Partnership of Historic Bostons. So thank you for that. But before I turn the stage over to our panelists this evening, I'd just like to tell you about our next history program. For the past several months, we have been hosting a 250th lecture series, and our next lecture, Washington Remembered, Washington Forgotten, Washington and Slavery, is happening next Monday, March 30th at 6 p.m., and our panelists are Kelly Racine Barnes, John Garrison Marks, and Kira Singleton. So you can find out more information about that program and register on the library's website. And so now I'm going to turn the podium over to Maryann Zujewski. She is a board member of the Partnership of Historic Bostons, and she will be moderating tonight's panel. Thank you.
And before I begin, we will have a period of question and answer after the discussion with our panelists. And we're asking if you do have questions, if you can put them on a index card, and we have pencils, and there's a little stack of them in the back over there. Oh, right over there. And so welcome everyone to The Past is Now. It's an intertribal discussion on King Philip's War. And we have four esteemed panelists here today that I'm really excited to introduce you to in just a minute. This is a second in an 8-part series entitled Metacom's Resistance, Retelling King Philip's War and Its Legacy. And indeed, an 8-part series is not enough for a story so complex. We're delighted to have you with us, and if this is your first time at a Partnership for Historic Boston's program, if this is your first time with us, we are a very small, nonprofit public history organization focusing on 17th century New England. And I'm Maryann Zujewski, and I'm a brand new volunteer and board member. So if you're interested in volunteering with us, just know they're just gonna put you right in there right away. Go for it, trial by fire. And why focus on the 17th century New England? Well, it's a foundational period. Really, everything that we know about New England today stems from this time period. And the Partnership of Historic Bostons has been telling the varied beginnings of New England's histories, as well as hoping to dispel myths of the past. And through public programs, that's been happening since 1999. There's lectures, discussions, walking tours. If you want to find out more, check out the website at historicbostons.org. I would also like to really thank our hosts for this evening, History Cambridge, and I see it up at the back there, hello. And we have staff from History Cambridge here today, and also Cambridge Public Library have been gracious hosts, and we're very grateful to partnering with us and having this program come here to Cambridge. The structure of the evening is we're going to do a little bit more introductions, and then we'll have a moderated discussion of about 50 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of that question and answer. And again, index cards for you, and as well as anyone attending online, put questions in the chat. I want to welcome our online attendees as well. And then finally, we'll do kind of a brief wrap up, tell you what's next, and also, you know, as a nonprofit history organization, make a plea for donations and volunteers. And so with that, I'll kind of dive into a little bit of an introduction. And tonight's program, The Past is Now. Ramona Peters is a Mashpee Wampanoag, and she remarked that the past has everything to do with who we are in this present moment, both individually and collectively. Personal and collective histories shape our dominant thought patterns, what we value, what we desire, and what we miss. King Philip's War is not just a 17th century conflict. It's a formative moment that established enduring systems of colonial power, shaping U.S. policies and cultural attitudes. This conflict that unfolded throughout New England remains one of the most violent conflicts in North American history. In proportion to population, the war inflicted greater casualties than any other war in American history. And yet it's not considered foundational enough to be really even in school curricula. This conversation brings together intertribal perspectives to think about how this history lives in memory, in community knowledge, and in ongoing struggles for sovereignty and representation. Tonight, we invite you to listen and to learn, to consider how your own views may need to be modified. We hope to bring you into the worlds of our four panelists here tonight as much as they allow, and add historical context to your understanding of Native American issues today and the history of New England in particular. So I'd like to turn next to meet our panelists, and I'm very honored to share this stage with Brad, Brittney, Elizabeth, and Hartman. And I encourage you to read their full bios on the Historic Boston's website or look them up, because I'm just going to say something brief, but I'm not sure they actually ever find time to sleep. They're so busy. Brad Lopes is a citizen of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, Aquinnah. He currently serves as the education manager for the tribe and as the education and outreach coordinator for the Aquinnah Cultural Center on Martha's Vineyard. Welcome, Brad. Brittney Walley is a Nipmuc artist and historian. Her interdisciplinary work is displayed in a permanent installation at the Concord Museum. And it's funny because I was just going to look up to see how long that installation was on, and then it's permanent. Because I wanted to make sure I go see it. She's a project assistant at the Institute for New England Native American Studies at UMass Boston and the anti mascot representative for her tribe. Welcome, Brittney. Elizabeth Solomon is a member of the Massachusett tribe at Ponkapoag, and she recently retired as the Director of Administration in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And she's committed to working with Native communities and others that are underrepresented in museum exhibits and in public history. Welcome, Elizabeth. And finally, Hartman Deetz is an enrolled member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. He is an educator, artist, and activist who spent over 30 years educating and advocating around the nation and the globe on issues of Native American rights and environmental justice. Welcome, Hartman. So with that, we'll sort of dive into the panel discussion. I have a nice seat over there that I'm going to sit down. And again, if there are questions that you think of and you want to anytime get up and grab an index card and pencil or have your own writing instrument, please do. How's this? Better. Perfect. Thank you. As we mark 350 years since the war, our goal here really isn't to commemorate this anniversary as something in the past. Indeed, The panel title, The Past is Now, it's for a reason. And in our conversations with panelists this week, actually the other day, Brittney had said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that this war is why everything is the way it is today. And she talked about an accordion sense of time, that the events of 350 years ago seem as though they happened yesterday. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this history is present today. Tell us more about how you experience this accordion sense of time. And Brittney, do you think you'd like to begin? You can always pass.
No, I'll take it. I'll take it head on. It's good to jump in. Thank you. So even tonight, what we're doing, we're talking, and I think we're really having an education aspect to this. So in my humble opinion, there is a deficit of knowledge about Indigenous history and presence everywhere, but yes, even here in Massachusetts. So like many people before me and now of the various tribes within Massachusetts, we're always kind of starting conversations with education. So I kind of see us as time traveling and jumping through hundreds of years back and forth, and it's like walking through a field. And the more you walk, all of that, hay goes down, and it's easier to find the path and go back and forth. So when we're talking about the accordion sense of time, or just an ease of being able to time travel and think of it, if we are thinking of time in a lineal sense, I kind of wanted to bring those metaphors to the surface. Like, it's a lot easier to consider and understand just how direct the events 350 years ago, how direct that influences today. So there's many different things, I think. It's kind of difficult to list them all, but I hope maybe explaining that metaphor opens up the conversation for the other panelists that I've taken this first question on for.
I'll kind of address it from a different perspective. I think that if people know about King Philip's War, they think about it as a war for who has control of the land. But it's way more than that. Really, in terms of the way I look at it it was and is a struggle about how we live in this world. So colonists and the settlers that came after them tend to look at almost everything as a commodity. And something to be things that can be made, profit can be made from. Whereas many, at least traditional Indigenous communities, see our environment and the place we live as a relative. So really what happened is really a start of a determination about how we are living in this world here in the United States, what became the United States. And when you think about it, we're at this point, at a point of climate crisis. And one of the reasons we're at a point of climate crisis is because of the way that we interact with the world. And we're at a pivot point. And so I argue the war's not over. It's still going on. And Indigenous people have not surrendered.
All right, I figured out, no, maybe not. Oh, there we go. I was gonna say, I think I figured out the microphone, not 100% sure, but clearly we're working now. I think when you asked that question, honestly, what it brought me back to is that moment, right, at Montauk on Mount Hope in June 1675, where the governor of Rhode Island, John Easton, is meeting with Medicom, attempting to essentially try to avoid what's about to happen in some way, shape, or form. And in that writing that Easton brings forward, essentially you're seeing a list of grievances, right, from Medicom and many other Indigenous kind of people at that time were experiencing. I think many of those things are still true. If you read that list of grievances, if you understand that, I think one of the things that I sit with and think about all day, every day, is encroachment and land dispossession too, because it is becoming harder and harder every single day for our folks to live in Aquinnah, where we have lived for over 12,000 years. You know, the average price of a house is $1.7 million in Aquinnah. And I do not have that because, again, we have been dispossessed of virtually everything as people in many ways, other than who we are. That itself can never be dispossessed or erased in any way. You know, and I think like the lasting impact of King Philip's War is also seen in the legal system of the United States. It's entirely built upon precedent that is set well before the establishment of the United States. Whether it's the doctrines of discovery, which were last cited in the Supreme Court in 2005, or if it's, you know, all different kinds of Mayflower Compact, they inform the legal tradition of the United States. And so many of these same actions that will occur after the war are also a part of that legal fabric of the United States. So the very relationship that we have with the United States is still one of subjugation. It is still that same one that colonial enterprises essentially you know, enacted upon our communities through warfare, through genocide, and other means. And unfortunately, we're still living in that today. And I just think to Gisantanamo, who's a Mashpee Wampanoag elder, who has said to me on multiple occasions that the United States and Canada, he's up in Canada, the United States and Canada occupy our homelands, but we have to find a way to move forward together. That's true, and not anything other than that.
Yeah, you know, definitely this is a conflict that is not just, you know, a matter of, you know, the colonization. It is a whole world sense of being and a dynamic of the shift of power in the world to this commodification and, extractive model. And it's a spiritual thing as well. You know, there's a forced element of Christianity, but I think that there's even a thing beyond that that hides within the Christian churches and even other faiths of the worship of money, you know, that has the banks as their temples. And this is a concept that we, you know, if you really start to peel back the layers, you know, Lindsey Graham and these other folks that, you know, they're not actually worshiping or following the teachings of Christ. They're worshiping this idea of profit and gain and commodification, and it's beyond even just the tangible elements of, you know, trees for lumber or land for growing or manufacturing or industry. It's coming down to the very way that we think that there's a need to control. We see it so much right now with the artificial intelligence, and you know the social media that I'm my own self addicted to, and you know can't stay off my phone. But there's such a programming where there's this push from every angle to conform, to not be anything unique, to not be anything different, but to conform and be just another same as the next. So that everything can be the same and everything can be predictable, everything can be controlled. It's just another node, another bean to be counted. And it stripped away the spirit. It stripped away our individuality. It stripped away our uniqueness to make us easily fit into this box, into this machine. And that continues on today, and that's very much right now. We still see that this is a struggle that we have. This idea that by subjugating and being willing to do the most horrible things to other human beings, that some of us can attain power over whatever we might choose, maybe even cheating death, who knows, right? That immortality, the fountain of youth, you know. And I mean, we see that this disease is definitely still with us right now today. You know, what did Trump say not too long ago? Cuba, I can destroy it, I can take it, I can do whatever I want with it, to tell you the truth. That's the mentality. That's the mentality that we faced then, and that's the mentality that has thrived and grown and, you know, really taken root in the world that we live in today, shaped so much of the world that we live in today. And I'm really hoping that we're at a point where we can all see and we can collectively come together and choose something different, because, you know, the world won't survive this, and, you know, we won't survive this as human beings, certainly. But, you know, there's been this thing, oh, well, the earth will shed us, but we're really worried about, you know, if we do all the terrible things we can, you know, we might not even have cockroaches left. You know, that's the truth of the matter. And if life is something precious, if life is something sacred, if there is something sacred, if sacred exists, you know, we got to do something to change this, because I think that that's, you know, that's what we saw, that we faced up against back then, and we continue to face up against today.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, no, because I think Hartman too, like what you're talking about, it reminds me a lot of that concept of like Western hegemony and like the colonial matrix of power, right? That we see kind of overlaid in that time period that really exists today, and really the structure we see all across the globe. You know, I think that that is a profound, powerful impact that impacts things like gender, sexuality, economics, all different kinds of things. And, you know, one of the things I'm fascinated by, where I think you see a lot of the cultural psychology of a people reflected, right, is in stories. And that is one of the reasons why I've always been attracted to science fiction, for example. And a lot of Western science fiction, what you see is a trend where if there is an environmental issue, you can engineer your way out of it, right? And so again, I think that there is radically different ways for understanding our relationship with this place and space. You know, and I even have talked to Native folks who have thought, like, why would I ever go to another planet? This is the perfect planet. We don't need to go anywhere else. We need to take care of this. And so I think you see a lot of that thought reflected in also the creations of these dominant structures and systems.
I just want to quickly say about what you're saying in terms of engineering out of things, is that we might be able to engineer our way out of what we're facing right now. But if we don't change, we're going to find ourselves in yet another situation in which we're repeating the same thing over and over and over again. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about that engineering thing. Like, we have this idea, we can find a way to fix it, but we're here because of the way we're living in the world. And if we continue, then something else will happen.
I was waiting for the perfect moment to jump back in. So I think another thing, because, you know, when I first led us, it was everything, and clearly it's so many things. I think another thing that I think we're all, it's in our minds, but I wanted to say it out loud, is the concept of thinking about one's lifetime versus multi-generationally. I think that's a huge part of it. So as I think everyone has mentioned, you know, the immediate ideas of commodification, which is proto-capitalism, right? So this as one of my mentors would put it, the commodification of nature, and sticking a price tag on all of that. And who was that for? It's for you right then in that moment in your lifetime, and maybe your kids. Maybe your grandkids if you're thinking that far forward into the future, but it's certainly not the next 7 generations. And that could also, of course, be a metaphor for a deeper amount of time as well. So I think that prevails today, and I think that you can see examples of that in every difficult example that has been surfaced so far. Is where is that mentality coming from? It's coming from here and now, and how much can I get, and what can I do, no matter the cost, to rise and continue on for me and maybe my kids. And that also doesn't really think about the futures of other people and other, people that you might consider all of your relations, human and not. So I think that if we consider the mind frame of the here and now and my immediate lifetime and that way of thinking, that has come from this war.
Well, I guess since everybody else got a couple go-rounds at it, I'm just gonna throw out there, the idea of being able to engineer our way out of it, which, I think that, we are capable of great things as human beings. Look at how much we've changed the face of every bit of the earth. We can engineer a lot, but also, what happens if we just stop? What if we don't? Do we remember those days of COVID? Early days of COVID, like how quickly the air cleared up, how we saw coyotes running through the streets of Boston. All of a sudden, it didn't take long. There's a balance in this world. And as Native people, one of the things that I've been taught is that our job is just to help maintain that balance. And that the world has a thing that it does on its own. And I think if we just stop doing the things to put it out of balance, there's a lot to be said for that as well. And, there's a real power in just maybe taking a step back and seeing what the world does to right itself.
Okay, my turn. No. I was wondering, Brittney, can you say a little bit more about this? Sorry. Just quickly for people, is the 7 generations, because it's 7 generations, not just forward that you're thinking about. Can you say a little bit more about that for our audience? Would you mind?
Sure. I always am cautious to speak for all of Native America, but I think at least the 4 of us here on stage are familiar with this idea of 7 generations, which can mean backwards or forwards. And really, I take it as this way to think that is beyond yourself and your time here on the earth. To be grateful for those that came before you and to consider what they did to get you to where you are today, and to remember that what you do today has a ripple effect throughout time. I think a lot of people could benefit from that, whether you really take it to heart in spirituality or in practicality. I can't force that on anybody, but if you take a minute and you think about how you and your presence today will ripple through time, I think we'd all be a little bit more responsible with our actions together.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I would say that, for most of us, if we're lucky, we might see 4 generations come behind us. That means that's your great-great-grandchildren. Your great-great-grand... No, okay, you might be able to see 5 generations if you're really lucky. But and if you really, if you really see a whole string of people having kids as fast as they can, well, some people might even see 6 generations. But there's no way in a human lifetime that you're going to see that 7th generation. So it's about thinking, not only those faces that you'll see in this world, but those that you'll never ever see and never meet, and to consider them as well.
Thank you. I want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. I feel like we've been in the present for a little bit, but I do want to step back a little in the past, because Brad talked about John Easton's writings, who John Easton had, as you mentioned, went to see Metacom in the hopes of maybe stopping what was going to happen in June of 1675 at Mount Hope. And John Easton recorded his conversation with Metacom and lists these grievances. And you can find this online. And I really suggest that you do that, because there's everything from beginning with the English that the English first had a good relationship with Metacom's father, who was Osa Miquim, the Massachusett of the Wampanoag people, and how that trust had been broken. And it's about justice equal in the court systems, how you can have 20 of the best Native people speak, and if one English person of no matter what repute says something different, then that's who's believed. So there's that reporting I think is really well worth a listen, but and a read. But one thing also out of that comes this of the list of those grievances, and that this is a war of resistance, that this doesn't come out of nowhere, that it's not unprovoked, as we might have, as I, a non-Native person growing up in New England, had learned, that this is a war of unprovoked attacks on, peaceful settlements. So something that we don't always hear about, and something I think Elizabeth had brought up too, is that this idea of this not well understood and not well told and explained is instances of Indigenous agency during the war. So if we can go maybe back in the past a little bit, talk about a little bit about the agency and the conflict that's really seldom discussed, and why it's important to know that today. So who wants to start? Does Elizabeth, would you like to start?
I think one of the things that, and I might kind of go over something that get covered maybe in a later question, but I think one of the things that is really interesting about the history as it's taught and the overarching mythology is that the outcome was inevitable. And that is really interesting because the outcome, one, wasn't inevitable, and two, what does that say about how we think about Native peoples and what we think about the Euro-American culture and the overarching sense of superiority that exists in our cultural milieu, whether we're aware of it consciously or not. But in reality, this was a struggle of Native people making decisions about how they were going to react to what was happening. And different communities, and in fact, different people within single communities made different decisions. But they made decisions about what to do. I really kind of want people to get away from that sense of inevitability. And that gets carried not just in this, but like Jared Diamond's Gun, Germs, and Steel. Just kind of like having this sense of this idea of this progression that goes from the primitive to the apex of European and American culture. And it's ingrained in us. It's ingrained in us. And I think one thing I would ask is for people to start thinking about how that comes out in your everyday thinking. And it's not really answering your question, but that's what I have.
I'd like to add something to that too, which might pull us back into the present for a minute. But when we're thinking about the differences, the different choices that people made, in that time period, the different tribes are so clearly different political entities making different choices. And as time progresses, through 5 or so years, you see a vast racialization of these different political entities. And that's something that I think the general public might view this war through as just one hodgepodge group all kind of racialized together, missing all of the nuances and the changes of decisions and the differences of decisions. And like I said, I'd bring us aside just for a minute, because I think that type of thinking influences the American zeitgeist, the imagination, the ideas of what Native American culture is today, when people assume it's a monolith. It's never been a monolith. Of course, the closer you are to a neighboring nation, more likely you're going to have a lot of similarities versus across, a huge landmass. But there's still differences, and these differences often they just get glossed right over because of this idea of inevitability. So we don't even get a chance to talk about, why did these tribes make different decisions? Why did people within the same tribe make different decisions? And what does that mean for those people and for us? So as we get, into these more specific primary sources that you're discussing, I think it's really good to keep that at the top of your mind, that these are different political entities acting as they should, right? Without an assumption that they're all going to do the same thing, which happens to Native activists today still. So keep that in mind as we talk about people who are recording it in the moment.
I think I figured out the delay. I gotta wait for the numbers to show up on here. All right. Yeah, I think that racialization, right? We saw it very recently with the Supreme Court case with Aquinnah, where Aquinnah was trying to be challenged, the Indian Child Welfare Act, based on racial preference. But again, it is, a political thing. We are sovereign political entities, and so first and foremost, that needs to be like the first understanding in many ways, I think, of tribal nations, because that racialization has been going on for a long time. Because essentially what you're seeing is it allows you to hodgepodge all of us into one group, and then that group can easily be targeted or addressed legally in other means and methods. And when I think about that racialization too, I think back to John Eliot's Indian Grammar Begun, because 1666, because he writes in it as examples. He's supposed to be teaching you more of like a lingua franca kind of language for the region. He offers 3 examples at one point where he actually offers you the language to learn, I am white, I am black, or I am red. So again, this racialization, this racial thoughts, it's emerging. This is the time period. It's being solidified and combining potentially with English cultural supremacy, which we also see too as well. The English, for the most part, are one of the few colonizing powers that were pretty staunchly opposed to intermarriage with tribal nations, at times outlawing it. Whereas the Spanish and Portuguese were known for, quote unquote, going Indian and joining our communities in some cases. There's a great example where some shipwrecked Spaniards in Florida walk all the way back to Mexico City in the 1500s. And somewhere around Louisiana, they encounter another Spaniard. And he's living with a tribe, and he has a family. And they're like, you want to come back? And he's like, no, I'm good. I like it. And so, again, you're seeing like that layers of like supremacy start to like trickle down. And that sense of race that we know today really solidify in many ways. And I think too, if we think back to those moments of agency, right, in that time period, one of the things I oftentimes will say too is I feel like the war almost begins in 71 and not really 75, or at least a moment of no turning back maybe, or a moment in which it's clear that any sort of chain of covenant, any covenant chain that exists here is broken. And that is largely several moves that Plymouth Colony will make on particularly Metacom and Awashonks in 1671, forcing the Seconic Sumpsquaw Awashonks to sign articles of agreement, as well as calling Metacom to Taunton to also largely subdue him by confiscating their weapons and essentially saying you are a subject of the king. I think it's extremely tactful what he does, though, because instead of actually following those orders, he goes to Boston instead and says, hey, they're violating the 1621 treaty by making me do this. And essentially, Boston steps in, and there's a fine that has to be paid later on. And so again, when we think about those moments of agency, whether it's that moment, whether it's even earlier, when you have Miantinomo, the Narragansett Sachem, 1643, I think he gives a speech where he's trying to recruit other people to a pushback against the English in many ways. And in that speech, you know, it ties into so many things we've been talking about, because he says along those lines of, if we do not unite together, because we are very separate, you know, obviously, if we do not unite together and push against these people, then there will be no clam beds, there will be no cornfields, there will be no forests, there will be no deer. Everything that we have known as Native people will disappear. And if you read that side by side with Metacom's grievances, for example, it's almost like they are intertwined in a way. They're living within that same scope, that same sphere. And so there are so many moments of agency that are occurring at this moment and at this time. And the reason why we don't talk very often about it is because the predominant narratives of the war, even today, are still not written from, and even told from, Indigenous perspectives. We are still the only group of people in the United States that have more books published about us that are written by non-Native people than Native people who are publishing books, essentially. So you are still seeing more and more books being written about us by people who are not us, unfortunately. And so I hope that's changing. I think it's changing. I see it changing. So yeah, we'll see where that kind of goes.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine going to abduct the figurehead of another nation and charging them with the crimes of their military people having guns? I mean, it's outlandish, isn't it? To think that something like, I mean, from today's standpoint, that might seem absurd. Yeah. But that's the whole colonial psychosis, right? And yeah, to bring it back, does anybody know the name Taddison? All right, so Taddison, he wasn't a big leader. He was a common man, and his family was killed by some colonists, some settlers, and he attempted to seek justice through the courts. But as said, his word was not enough against the English people, who just all they had to say, I didn't do it. And so he sought revenge by his own hands, and he killed that colonist and that colonist family. And then he chose to sit upon a rock in Plymouth and wait for the English folks to come and round him up and hang him, because he knew that that would be his fate. And that was life as we were expected to endure it. We were expected to endure that kind of humiliation, that kind of lack of value, that kind of dehumanization. And that's just against our nature as human beings, and as any kind of living spirit, to endure something like that. People can't continuously be subjugated to that kind of dehumanization without breaking towards violence. That's just the fact of the matter. And it wasn't just this one incident of Taddison. There's Combatant, there's Peksuit, there's the Pequot massacre, which I think was largely an economic action. This was one of the main places for the production of the tube beads of wampum. They produced most of the tube beads of wampum that were used as a medium of exchange, and also the recording of our histories, and in the form of belts and collars. And but this was also what the English started to adapt as their currency. They also abducted Wamsutta as well, and held him and demanded that he give over his land. Give us your land, or you can give us 600 fathoms of wampum. And so they came up with the 600 fathoms of wampum rather than give up that land. They knew that the land was far more valuable than the 600 fathoms of wampum, more valuable than any kind of currency. So yeah, when this is the kind of treatment that you're given, it should come as no surprise to anyone that the response will be to push those people out, force those entities out that are subjugating people. We all are human beings at the very fundamental level of it, and to be able to have our dignity and our humanity intact is something that our spirits and our souls need. And when we are denigrated so much, eventually, we are left with very few choices, and one of the very few choices that we might have is to act out with violence to end that oppression and end that degradation. Because people cannot continue to live like that, and our spiritual sense of well-being cannot remain intact under that kind of oppression. And that's just the fact of the matter. That's why we need to be able to treat other human beings with that kind of dignity, and what we see a lack of in this world right now. So we'll see where that leads us, right?
Beat you to it. I wanted to add something, because obviously it's so important to look at the non-passive actions of Native people, because often that's how it's framed, but also to shed a different light on the colonists, because I think sometimes history feels a little too familiar with them, and I think we forget that unless you study what they were writing and you also take it with a grain of salt, you don't know them. There's this change, from the 1620s to the 1670s, and keeping that line of thought, if you then continue to watch how people commemorate 100 years later, 200 years later, we have these big myth-building stories that go, they're larger than life. And you need to cut through that, and you need to have a better understanding of what was it like for people in the 1620s. It was raw, I'll say that. And the people of 1620, if we're thinking about generations, are not the same people necessarily 50 years later. Now there's a new generation of people who are born here and feel even more entitled to take more of what's here because this is their home, as they would imagine. I think that it's fair to say, oftentimes, if you have an oppressed and an oppressor, the oppressed knows much more about the oppressor. So I think it's fair to say that there is a continuity of Native people observing and adapting on a dime to survive and to figure out how to interact with these people who are not going away. And I dare say that because the attitudes are shifting and the way that people are feeling more entitled to this homeland because they were not born in Europe. They were not born, and to be specific about where as well is important. As we just mentioned, differences between people who, might be more inclined to be a blended community, but certainly not the Puritans, certainly not the English folks. So, to understand who they are, I think that brings a lot of texture and a lot of insight to the understanding of why people did what they did. And I think it's also important to look at them, because obviously Native people we've always been looked at as the other. Our art has often been subjugated to the area of anthropology, and then the European classics, that's art history, and there's a difference. I think you need to remember that this colonial culture has a huge influence on us today, but it's not exact culture of today, and this is a culture that you need to study as well. and you need to understand it. I think that's important when we're talking about, why Native people did what they did. And one thing that I think is clear is, of course, we're reading a lot of texts written from this particular culture that does not care for many aspects of the Indigenous values that they might have seen but didn't care to write down, like people who were women. So that's just one huge example. So yeah, I think there's something worthy about studying them as the other in a way. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you made me think of this concept, Brittney, that I've been kind of trying to figure out a name or even flesh out more in idea, but the only thing I've come up with so far is this concept tidal intent, right? Like how a tidal wave builds up over time. The force is there from the beginning, but the wave doesn't really hit until later on, right? We don't see the wave until it breaks, really. Because I think a lot of the intentions I think a lot of the actions of the 1670s are laid forward in the intentions of the 1620s. And even though those attitudes will shift, the intention is clearly there, I think, early on. I think it's really evident in charters and patents for colonies. Mashpee colony is a sea-to-sea charter, which means it's from here to the Pacific Ocean is ours. And I think that's even funny because not only did they not ask us, obviously, but they didn't even ask the Dutch, who this will clearly intersect, but we all know how that story kind of goes, hopefully. But, I think about that tidal intent that's clearly there early on, and, I think could even be argued as being laid in England, even before some of this is happening, in a variety of ways. And, back to that, moment of agency, right? I think one of the biggest impacts, because one of the themes we've talked about today, too, as well, is commodification, right? What does it mean to be a commodity, to commodify something? I think 1675 to 78 is a critical turning point in this region because there are many people already commodifying us. But now it is almost like a state-sanctioned commodification of Indigenous people, period, across the board. Why? Because we will be enslaved left and right. We will be used as indentured servants. We will be considered wards of the state, or wards of the Commonwealth, or wards of the province. All of these different kinds of mechanisms. But I think back to that moment of agency too, right, within that story. Well, I think of a group of people who show up in Plymouth General Court in 75 who are surrendering under the notion that they will basically receive, what's that word, amnesty or something? When you're not charged for crimes if you surrender during a conflict or charged with being involved, basically. And they will end up enslaved, unfortunately. In 1683, John Eliot will receive a letter from what I suspect are some of these same exact people, because he references that moment and says that they were surprised Indians, which he's referring to that moment where they tried to surrender and then were enslaved. But they are enacting their agency because in 83 they will write a letter to Eliot all the way from Tangier, which is in Morocco, if you're familiar. They had been, some of them had been basically off-put in Tangier and sold off there. And they are writing a letter to Eliot to try to get home. I don't know what happened to them. I haven't done that far research. I don't know if anyone knows necessarily. I know Lynn Fisher talks about it too in his work. And I think about that moment, right, too, because if you know what's happening in Tangier in 83, it is under siege by the Sultan. and the English are holding that territory. They've been using it as a colonial port. And so these people are under siege while this is happening too. But doing everything within their agency and power to get home. And I think about that a lot too, because, right, we're an extension of the land, and the land is an extension of us, right? What does it mean to be cut off from that? To be brought elsewhere, like all across the world? And I don't really have words for that. But I think in that moment, you're seeing that agency and doing what we could to get home. There will be folks who do come home in many ways, through different methods, through different means. And there'll be different folks who will avoid that same thing. I'm thinking of the gentleman from Mashpee who goes to the Crown in 1763. They attempt to enslave him along the way, and he's like, heck no. I'm going to the Crown, and I am putting forward our complaints, and we are fixing things here. And so there's all these moments of agency. I mean, from 1493 onward, Indigenous people are going to Europe, oftentimes by force, but sometimes by choice as well, to enact our agency, advocate for our people, and understand you and I, whether it's the King of England or whoever it might be, our peoples, we're equal political entities here. You're not going to subjugate us. And so, highly recommend the book On Savage Shores, really great, kind of gets you into that time period and the people going to Europe as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to add in that, you know, it's one of these things that stands true even through today as we talk about that accordion sense of time. You know, for a native tribe to have a reservation where our jurisdiction applies, we have to give that land over to trust in the federal government, because Native Americans are incapable of managing our own affairs. You know, that racialization of that inferiority still exists. We can't manage it. We can't do it. We are incapable of managing our own land, managing our own systems of governance. So we have to turn it over to the federal government to do it on our behalf, because they are so successful.
Add something? I realized I didn't bring my phone or, oh, very good. Roxanne has like a time, like, oh, what time is it? Can someone tell me what time? 7 o'clock. Oh, 7 o'clock, exactly. Okay, all right, wonderful. So I think this would be a good moment, and Hartman has kind of brought us full circle with, wait, something you just mentioned, but now I've forgotten, but. Yes, accordions, yes. So he brought us right back to where we started with the accordion of time. And so I think it's a great time to take some questions from the audience. And Roxanne, if we want to, who has some questions that they might?
We have file cards for you to write your questions on.
Yes, and if people have some questions, want to hand to Roxanne, or what about, and if there's anything from the chat as well. Does anybody have a question?
Yes, I have one that I'm going to bring up.
Oh, excellent, very good.
There's a question right there.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, this is, I think this is a good one. In light of the 250th anniversary of the states, how do we bring the events of King Philip's War to the fight for independence as perpetrated in the foundation myth of the United States?
You know, there's a huge influence that native democracy has on the colonists. That when there's the powers that be. One of the other things I was just going to mention is reading in the history of Brighton down at the Brighton Library. There's this charter given by the King of England to the guy for Oak Square, basically, and he says he shows up here and he finds a whole village of Indians interloping on his land. The audacity of it. But then there's the common people, A lot of people that are coming over here into these colonial situations are trying to find some way to live, you know. They are not the wealthy, they are not the powerful in Europe, and they're pushed out or they're brought over and indentured themselves. You know, why a lot of the Scots and the Irish in particular escaped their English, I don't know, what do you call it when you're an indentured servant? Who do you serve? Is it still your master? But they escaped that, and they live amongst the native folks of Odanak to the point where they had a pretty big population of Scots and Irish because they didn't want to live under that subjugation either. And they could find freedom amongst us. The same is true with a lot of the captive narratives of women who would be amongst our folks in captive. Some of them didn't want to go back because they knew that amongst native people that they could own land, that they could have a home, and they could have equal voice and equal say and be treated with the same kind of dignity as their male counterparts. And native democracy is a very ground up, from the bottom up means of rule rather than a top down structure of power. And that rubbed off on their neighbors. And, you know, where they talk about this idea of, you know, the Mayflower Compact or Greek democracy, really, truly, I think it was their experience of having to see native people and how we functioned and how we governed over ourselves that made these colonists realize that there's a better way to do things. The term caucus itself is an Algonquian word. That's how we do our democracy. That's how we come together to vote. And it has to be more than just a simple majority. You have to have an overwhelming majority. You shouldn't have to count the heads. There should be a clear, greater number on one side than there is on the other, physically standing there. And we still have the caucus throughout New England today. That shows the influence of native democracy and native forms of governance on our colonial neighbors. You know, there's a lot of things that influenced and impacted the English people, the Irish people, the Dutch people, whoever it was that came here. They saw how we lived and they said, wait, maybe there is a better way. Maybe we don't need kings. Maybe the church isn't always right. You know, look at this thing that we can grow from the ground and we can eat it. It's called a pumpkin. Maybe we can mix our crops. Maybe we can grow the pumpkin and the corn and the beans all together and we'll have more food. That was something that was forbidden over there. And you'll see a lot of different examples of how we lived here that influenced the people that came here. And they said, we're going to do things like they do it. You know, you'd see the adaptation of people wearing the buckskin or taking the birch bark canoes, the old town canoe that's so famous. It's just a copy of the native canoes. And a lot of the democracy that we see in the United States is also a copy, whether the copy of the Iroquois Confederacy coming together, or whether the caucus, or whether just seeing how the clan mothers operated and advocated for their people as a representative form of democracy. All of these things are a part of how native people influenced their neighbors and showed them that there are other different ways to live other than under the rule of a king with absolute rule. And when you see that kind of freedom, when you taste that kind of freedom, it's hard to go back to the other stuff that you know, that you may have known so well.
No, that's only our first question, but I just had one other thing that stood out in my mind, and I would implore everyone to consider what the revolution promised and what that might mean to people today, and who the promise was to, because it certainly wasn't to Indigenous people, or, as it might say in a certain document, merciless Indian savages who were inciting the king against the colonies. You know, clearly Indigenous people were not the ones that the revolution was promising all these good things to, but I think if we're going to engineer our way out of anything, people need to remember that these promises, these things should be accessible to everyone, which was not the case when it was first made. And as Hartman has put it, you know, we Native people we're just a part of this culture, whether you realize it or not. It's baked in. You can't get away from it. You can try to turn a blind eye to it, but you have to remember that at this point, if we're not thinking about everybody here, because we're all here now, so what are we going to do together but move forward and remember that these promises are owed to everybody here now.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the commemoration of the revolution. I think in terms of thinking about how to connect them is really an attempt to tell a more true and more complete history of this country, because what we're celebrating is not the truth. I mean, that's my position. So I think that realistically, if we are just going to commemorate something that is only a promise for certain people, and we have huge levels of inequity, what are we celebrating? So learn your history, learn the full history.
You know, honestly, I interpret the American Revolution more as a civil war between a nation state that is engaging in colonization and the budding, growing settler colony or colonies that it has established. Now they have grown to the point where they're an adult. They don't want to be under their mother or parents' tutelage and control anymore. So if we frame it in terms of a fight for independence, it's a fight to have independence over power and control. As well. I think that that's something that we have to think about, because you have to also think about the multiple moments in which the colonial governments or the king themselves in England also want to be directly controlling or have a say over any transactions of land, any possession of land that is occurring. It is actually the predecessors that informed the 1790 Non-Intercourse Act, that says that Congress has to approve all transactions of indigenous land, which of course each and every single moment of these they have failed to actually follow through and enforce that. And so what you're seeing too, this is based on like earlier initiatives too, and also even the 1763 proclamation line as well. You cannot settle west over the Appalachian Mountains. So the king it's not that the king is not protecting them, it's that they want to expand west. And, you know, just a couple of years, a decade after that, they've had enough. There's so many of them that are business entrepreneurs. You know, and I know there's a talk about Washington coming up. I mean, many of the Haudenosaunee call him the town destroyer, you know? And so, like, how do we have that understanding of him as well? How do we have the understanding of him as that person? You know, in many ways, and not just this almost unhuman figure of freedom that I see in so many interpretations and narratives of these moments. You know, I think if we want to talk about like a revolution that embodies freedom, and truly, I think you need to look to Haiti, not the United States.
And I'm just going to add in, you know, don't forget they dressed as Indians during the Tea Party.
Several questions have come in. Very good. There's two here, or there's a couple on the similar vein, and two that I'm wondering if we can kind of connect together, because I was hoping that maybe the panelists would speak to this as well. But it's about wondering how Metacom is remembered in your communities, but also a question about the matriarchy and how that could be potentially a model for change. But I think one of the things, and somebody maybe sort of alluded to this, is that the focus of the name of the war on Metacom, on King Philip, erases and doesn't give, puts it neatly in this package, but also focuses on this one person and about how many women leaders were also involved in this. So I don't know if somehow maybe addressing a little bit about how Metacom might be remembered in your communities, but also a little bit about women.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, there's a reason it's called King Philip's War as opposed to Weedamu's War. They said Weedamu is warrior queen, and a lot of the land conflicts that really pushed towards this war were conflicts where she kept coming back to court to say, no, my brother didn't have the right to sell this land. No, my husband didn't have a right to sell this land. No, my son didn't have a right to sell this land because it's my land and I am the only one who has the right to sell it. A lot of that land was attempting to be bought by Benjamin Church, who was the main financer of the first militia companies to go and fight in King Philip's War. So he had a lot of financially to gain, you know, as far as his land claims in that war. It was said that Weedamu could field more men than Philip himself, and yet it's known as King Philip's War because time and time again they didn't want to acknowledge that a woman had that kind of power or authority within the world, and certainly within our world, women did have that kind of power and authority. And by and large, more often than not, land title was tied to women. And family lines were tied to women. You know, that's how things were more often than not done within our people. So, you know, you talk about, you know, the land and who has title to it and how do you gain access to it, it's through the women. And that's what the settlers were after.
I would add that the memory of Metacom, you know, when we use him to frame the war, well, when he dies is not when the war is over. So we can't tie it to the end of his lifetime. So not to take away from obviously everything that he did, but it goes beyond him. He was certainly not in it for his lifetime, and yet we do this thing where we truncate the name to his lifetime. But the war continues on, and what's important, I think, to bring here is as the war continues on more north, there's a lot of Native success, and then things conclude in 78, not when he died, 2 years after he died. Things are still going on. I think that obviously adds to how oversimplified we might view all kinds of war, you know? But I would also say that he was not the only person leading forces. So as a Nipmuc, I feel it's my responsibility to mention some of the Nipmuc people who led successful battles. You know, you have to learn about Mudawamp and Matunis, and you have to learn about Weedamu and Ashawonks. You have to learn about more than just, and these are the big names that I feel as though Native historians, like when we say them, well, we definitely all know, but clearly we've talked about other Native people who are resisting in different ways, so we know there's plenty more, and there's probably even more that no one cared to write down. So I think that in a way it does a disservice to all of the people I'm sure Metacom was trying to bring together and to you know, call to action when we just place it on one person and make it seem like, oh, this one guy has a problem, so it's not that big of a deal. It was clearly a system of networks of kinship and political ties with many different actors. And again, it goes on after he even passes. So that's a complexity I want to bring up.
I think the other thing is that it fits in with the dominant culture's tendency to focus on individuals. And so, and you were talking about George Washington earlier, it's like we put, in the dominant culture puts all of the mythology and the agency and the sometimes responsibility on an individual, as opposed to looking at, one of the things we've talked about is, when we met before, was like how complex this issue is. And in a way, one of the ways of not looking at the complexity is to look at an individual instead, because there's only certain things that you can talk about with an individual, and an individual's an individual, and no individual does anything on their own, ever.
I think too, like, it's really important to talk about like traditions of like Western historiography, right? And how do these things like come to be? And also there's a weird ironic connection with the name and the revolution, the American Revolution later on, right? If we're overthrowing a king, right? If we're fighting a tyrant, a king, it justifies this in many ways, right? And so when you start to actually see the name king attached to Philip is really during the war and preceding just before the war. And so they are essentially like attributing like that maniacal, like kind of tyrannical kind of attributes to Metacom. And as his life progresses, when he is sachem, from 63 to 76, you can literally see in English documentation like a slow, I shouldn't even call it slow actually, a progression towards interpreting him as almost demonic in many ways. I think of things like Increase Mather's writings. I think of other folks too as well, but if you haven't read Increase Mather's book on the war, it is a trip and a half. I think he like names us like in the first paragraph, he says something like the Wampanoags and Narragansetts. We're the only two that he names too, by the way, because he's not very good at that either. And then the rest of the book, all Indigenous people will be hereon referred to as heathens. And I think too, like, I think it's important that there needs to be this understanding of that conflict too that is very similar to how we understand like the Crusades and other holy wars. Because if you look at the language being used, particularly by church officials, but even government officials, this is very much so being perceived as very similar, a fight against evil, a fight against the devil in many ways. And I think one of the most clear ways to see that sometimes is right in the primary sources, right? So you can go to MHS, Mass Historical Society, you can look at the Winslow collection, and you can see where Josiah Winslow is writing a certificate or something. I don't want to use that name because it's not, I think, officially called that, but it is a government document that is condemning over 100 Indigenous people to perpetual servitude and slavery, men, women, and children, it says. But the document, what is most interesting to me about it is actually that it's not addressed to Plymouth Colony, it's not addressed to Mashpee Colony, it's not addressed to English settlers, it's addressed to all Christian people. And then it, towards the end, it says that they are to be sold to the next Christian prince or state. And so we have to have that understanding of the war too as well, that very clear good versus evil aspect of it. And so I think like the way that we understand it, the centering on a single individual, when this tension is being felt in every single community, and this is well known. I mean, I think they go out of their way to try to create a treaty with the Narragansett before all these events happen, because they know that they're upset. And then obviously when the Great Swamp Massacre happens, go right on in. There's no avoiding it at that point. And so I think there's like, all of these kind of critical moments from that historiography we have to kind of think about. And also how is that being carried forward, right? What's that memory of Metacom? Why are there statues of Usamiqua all across the United States actually? Where's there one for Metacom? Other than like maybe the plaque that we had to fight for. Brittney, you're smiling like you know of one too. And this is gonna be probably good tea. But, you'll be nervous now. But But right, how do we form like these tropes or these like characters, these archetypes that become a part of like American mythology, right? Do you fall within the bucket of good Indian or bad Indian, right? And Metacom for many people has fallen into that bad bucket, right? You know, again, I don't necessarily, I think Metacom is perhaps the most patient person ever, to be honest with you. You have to think about the fact that potentially when he's a little child, there's English settlers that are living 40, maybe 30 miles away at the most, and by the time he is sachem, they are 6 miles away. So he has seen this happen with his own lifetime, right? And not really made in action in many ways. But that's not just happening there in Pokanoket. Like, that is happening all across this area. And I forget the author of it, but there's a great map that shows, like, it's called like 3 fronts of colonization. And what I really like about it is you can see clearly on the map how many of our people are largely surrounded at this point. You have settlers going up the Connecticut River Valley to the west. You have Mashpee. You have the province of Maine. It's almost like forming this circle, encircling us in our homelands, right? And so this tension is being felt by all of our communities, you know, and shout out to Brittney too as well for the whole, this doesn't end in 1678, I mean 1676, sorry, it ends in 1678. And I think of this one attributed quote to Mog, and I think Mog's like, I can't remember if he's Penobscot or Abenaki, but they are very concerned at a comment he makes because he says something along the lines of, I know how to burn down Boston. And at that point, I think they were like, okay, we need to get out of this. We're gonna lose, or it's gonna be worse. Tell me.
I have something to add. Speaking of burning towns down, so to bring us before the war in 1635, apparently all of the coastal colonies are too full, so they need to grant these 2 large swaths, you know, of land. So Concord and historic Dedham are born. And then out of Dedham, the mother, you know, of all towns, there becomes Medfield. And this is interesting because the town I live in used to be a part of historic Medfield, right? So I live very close to what is now considered Medfield. And somewhere in Medfield is someone who still drives their car around with the King Philip's Warriors mascot bumper sticker. And I see them all around. So when you were mentioning how do we embody, how do we memorialize, what about the statues, I think one other thing to answer to the question of the individual is that it is so easy to dehumanize this one person that we imagine into a lesser than and into something akin to an animal, because the mascot, you know, could be something as innocent as, you know, I don't know, an alligator, an animal of some sort, or we could just, you know, totally demote someone who is human into lesser than and put it on a bumper sticker. And it is kind of ironic because when I see them around town, I'm like, if anybody here was a King Philip's warrior, because Nipmuc people did, we burnt down Medfield, and if anyone here today is a King Philip's warrior, it's definitely not you driving your SUV. It's just not. So I think really my point is, when we're looking at the individual, you have the power to craft the story however you want to, and one of those ways is by simplifying and demonizing this one person to then try to put that idea on the whole series of events.
Yeah. And just to the point of, you know, the 2 buckets, good Indians and bad Indians, right? I can't speak for every Native American. I mean, I guess I could try, but I know myself and many other New England Native people still hold Metacom as a beloved hero, and that's just the truth of the matter.
Thank you for that. Oh, we can. Yes, I was going to say it must. I was just going to do a closing here because I thought that one more question, because Hartman kind of brought us back to Metacom. Well, I think something that you have talked about a lot this evening, and maybe this isn't a good way to just sort of rattle off. I think there's been a couple of questions from the audience about what are the Indigenous authored sources and books that you might recommend for people. I will say, and if we don't want to sort of rattle some of this off, we're putting together a resource page on the Historic Boston's website that is up, and I have some more to add to it because I've been so I've just been reading actually the Historical Archaeology and Indigenous Collaborations, which is, okay, so that addresses a lot of the things that we've talked about here tonight. That's about the Nipmuc community. Yeah. Oh yes. That's right. The sources that Brad has talked a lot about are at the Congregational Library and Archives, and they've put together a resource guide that we've shared too on our website. Did you want to mention something about that source?
I wanted to emphasize your suggestion because that book changed my life.
I got it from you because you mentioned it in a so.
Well, so don't let the title fool you because, it does talk about archaeology, but it is a collaborative effort, and I can't emphasize it more, and it is super accessible reading-wise. It's not opaque and layered in all of this, language that you can't understand, to the point where the book editor did challenge the 4 writers, one of which is Dr. Ray Gould, who is Nipmuc, like myself. The editor challenged them to have no in-text citations. It's accessible, it's readable, and it involves storytelling. And I champion it not necessarily as an example that can bring you into archaeology and anthropology. I champion the book as something that is a great example of what collaboration can look like. There's no panacea for that. You have to build up unique relationships and trust, but it's something to refer to that I think is just invaluable in today's world of asking how do we do better. And I would also suggest for people interested in 250 or 350 years of history and beyond to read Firsting and Lasting by Jean O'Brien.
Are these just recommendations in general or specific to the war?
Recommendations in general, I think. Or specific to the war? Is that what you... Oh, okay.
Well, no, I was just curious because I was going to pivot. It's not war specific.
Best resources written by Indigenous authors or for learning about Metacom's resistance. This was one. But.
If you haven't read it yet, Get Nothing More of This Land by Joseph Lee. Okay, it's really good. And Jojo is a cousin, and so just really good. And yes, I'm selfishly plugging his book. Please buy his book. Another one, so being in education, right? Like one of my favorite things is reading aloud to little kids. And so Wampanoag Seasons by Carrie Ann Vanderhoop is a really good kids book, as well as Grandmother Moon. That one is really hit me in the feels while I was reading it out loud to little kids, actually. So really wonderful books. The children's Indigenous authored books area has really, really grown and expanded like the last 5 to 10 years, something like that. So if you got littles, or you know somebody with littles, or you volunteer with littles, like get those books. They're really good. Yeah, that's I guess all I have that comes to mind.
It's really unfortunate because there isn't a lot of books that have been put out by Native authors on this subject. Tons of different sources, decent sources that are non-Native, but we haven't been given too much of an opportunity to voice our own story, and even the authors that can think of, Vine Delora Jr., the book Patriot Chiefs. He covers lots of Native leaders and resistance against colonization. One of them being Metacom. It's a section in that book, but he's a Western native. He's not actually from New England. There's also After King Philip's War, which has a section in that book by Ella Sukatow, Narragansett Elder, and that's an authentic voice from our people, but it focuses more on the repercussions that what happens after the fighting ends. Linda Coombs has just put out the book Race to Colonization, which is not necessarily focused on the war itself either, but looks at the conditions that drive the people towards the war. But I can't really think of a particular book by Native people by New England Native people. Well, Lisa Brooks, from what I've been told, there's some questioning about whether she actually is a Native woman. And that's, so I won't put her out there as a Native author, unfortunately. I do think that the scholarship and the work in that book is incredible, and it's worth reading, whoever she is, whatever her background is. But if you're asking for Native authors in particular, I don't think that we can count her as one. But if we're going to look at that, one of the main ways that I've learned about this war is through the primary resources, whether it's Benjamin Church's journal, Increase Mather, and the folks that were writing in the time. And you have to read through these books and read through them with an understanding that you're reading through English and colonial bias, and have to look at it and read it with those eyes.
I also want to just say that I agree with everyone that there are very few Indigenous authors who are writing about New England history, New England Indigenous history. And yes, there are things that are written by non-Indigenous people that are quite good. And I would challenge folks, how can each and every one of us change this? How can folks who are interested in this history make sure that they are engaging with Indigenous people? So it's not always folks that are non-Indigenous who are writing this, and not always people who are non-Indigenous deciding what the important things are to be said and to be disseminated. I don't know if people know the statistics, but Native Americans are the least likely folks to go into graduate education. And one of the things that the publishing industry values are folks who have, at the minimum, a master's, but usually a PhD. So really, in not just asking what's out there, what can individuals who might have the means and the interest to be doing this, to be engaging more closely with folks, public historians that are Indigenous and Indigenous communities. That can help.
I would add to that too, if you're not going to something live or something, you're looking into something new. Honestly, if you're reading a non-native author, read their acknowledgments and see who they were in relation with. It's probably, if it's a good book, the acknowledgement list is going to be very long because they were in relation with different Native people from different Native tribes. Just to kind of sharpen my skills for tonight, I was going back through Memory Lands by Christine DeLucia. So not an Indigenous person, but I think something that would be a worthy recommendation. And I think it's also a good example of proper acknowledgments. And so I would tell people, keep your wits about you when you're looking for resources.
Yeah, I really about that acknowledgement section too, and talk to us about it. Talk to us about that book, that author, right? Is that an authentic interpretation of what's happening as well? Because our community in Aquinnah has definitely been presented as having a very good relationship with a certain scholar who's not really even that welcome in our community that much. So Again, I think it's like really understanding and talking to the people too, really about those kind of core things. And I will share that if you're looking for more published stuff, that I worked with Mass Historical Society to create a primary source learning kit for schools that's on the war. And I was asked to write like a historical overview thingy. Love my academic words here. And I think it was supposed to be like 5 pages, like 17. So like, go for it. It'll be published soon. Go check it out. And there was like something else I had, but honestly, I forgot. And I think we're probably all getting a little pretty tired at this point. So I'm gonna shut up.
Yeah, and I think what I would add is, and you stole mine, Christine DeLucia's memory. That's okay. I was going to mention that. But one thing that I would encourage you all to do, and this is something we've put on our resource list, is go to the official sites of each of these tribes and of the tribes in New England, because starting with the sources and learning about where this is and how are the government shaped and what are their main imperatives and priorities for their communities today is a good way to also start that. Yes, so we're going to close up here, and I want to begin by just thanking all of the panelists for sharing your insights, your experiences, your perspectives. And I want to thank you also for being here tonight, for engaging in this conversation with care and with respect. We're also, again, grateful to our partners at History Cambridge and the Cambridge Public Library. How about a round of applause for them? Thank you. And before you go, I want to tell you sort of just what's coming up next. This is a second in a 8-part series. Again, not enough, and we want to continue to do more. We hope that you're going to join us for the other programs that might address some of the questions that you asked that we will be addressing perhaps in other programs throughout the series. If you didn't get a card, I think these cards are up front, and this lists all of the programs. So take extras and give to your friends. Share those copies. Because the next one is actually April 8th. It's the 3rd program, and it's with Linford Fisher, who has just come out, who is non-native. He has just come out with this book, Stealing America, The Hidden History of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History. And we're actually offering that book for sale at half price, so it's $20. So it's a good deal. And we have plenty to purchase.
And that cover is by Silver Moon LaRose, who is a Narragansett artist and educator and amazing human being.
And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Brad wasn't going to say David Silverman. I'll say it.
I was wondering that.
I think he plagiarized me. I'm pretty sure he did.
Oh, that's okay. So again, because I know that you all have a lot of questions about a whole variety of things connected to this conflict, we need to continue to do more on this. And just, I guess, one final thought before you go is we are a very small nonprofit. If you are interested in working with us and volunteering with us, you're welcome to. Please see, Sarah was just here. Please see Roxanne, Sarah, anyone with a pink badge about, or go to our website. And also, it's a free series that's coming to you, and strictly through the generosity of people like you who want to donate. And we have QR codes that if you're interested in donating to pay for this series, which we're doing and trying to get the funds to continue, and for future series as well. So thank you all very much. Have a good night, a safe return home. And I think that path